Thank you, everybody, for an absolutely scintillating first session. For anybody who's just joined us, my name is David Shankland. I'm the director of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and we're here to celebrate the launch of, well, certainly the launch in England of a remarkably important volume edited by Professor Andre Gingrich and Peter Rohrbacher, a work which I think will stand as being an absolute monument in the history of anthropological publishing. It is a masterpiece. To write the history of anthropology, from an institutional point of view is not an easy thing to do. In fact, easy thing to do at all. In fact, it's remarkably difficult. But what our two editors and their fellow authors have done is taken an extremely complex but crucial period of history, and they've shown from multiple perspectives how anthropology and anthropologists have interacted with their times. And they've shown both those who have turned out to be, we might say, on the wrong side of history, and those who were persecuted during those times for supporting liberty and freedom. At the same time, they have done so in a way that's methodologically meticulous, really a model for us all. Now, as I mentioned, the work is in 3 volumes. It's not yet been translated into English, but I hope that one of the things we might even discuss here is the way that might be done. But for those of you who are interested in Professor Gingrich's basic arguments, I should remind you that he has already published a summary in a book that indeed Chris Hahn helped to put together, inspired already in 2005, an essay which is called The German-Speaking Countries, in the book entitled One Discipline, 4 Ways, British, German, French, and American Anthropology. That essay, beautifully written in crystal clear language, caused something of a sensation, I think we can say, for those of us interested in that period. And now we see the fruits of this much wider work. I think the best thing to do now is to turn to Professor Gingrich, who will talk about the methodological basis of this work, how it was all put together, before we move on to the more substantive themes. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much to David Shankland for this thoughtful introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here with us. My contribution to this presentation of the 3 co-edited volumes on Völkerkunde from Vienna, under the Nazi regime and in exile, will combine a few main methodological points, as suggested by David, with a single case example. The case example relates to a rather unknown figure today, Victor Christian, a Semitic studies expert and ethnographer, also trained in ethnography. Before 1945, Christian was perhaps the highest ranking professor in the humanities in the Nazi hierarchy anywhere between Leipzig, Krakow, Prague, Salzburg, and Graz. In addition to being moved into the University of Vienna's dean's position after Austria's annexation by the Nazis, he also was department head for socio-cultural and for physical anthropology at the University of Vienna until 1940, an influential new member at the Vienna Academy, and he remained president of Vienna's Anthropological Society from 1936 until right to 1945. Here, however, I will focus on his leadership of a newly founded specialized unit in the so-called Ahnenerbe, or ancestral legacy, the SS research elite organization under Heinrich Himmler's command. This LFVO unit, under Christian's direction, was politically the most relevant entity with a strong ethnology/Völkerkunde component in it during the Nazi years anywhere in the Third Reich. It carried out so-called field research in Nazi camps for African and Central Asian prisoners of wars, as well as among Roma and Gypsy inmates in their separate camps, usually shortly before they were murdered or perished otherwise. And it also was instrumental for the Muslim defectors from the Red Army to the SS. Most of the basic details concerning this LFVO were largely unknown before our publication, and so it was essential to pursue a solid methodology in this as much as in the other cases presented in these 3 volumes by our 25 authors, whom we both as co-editors are extremely grateful for their huge efforts. So I'll try to demonstrate how our main methodological orientations were put into practice for the case of Viktor Christian's SS Ahnenerbe unit, this LFVO. We chose the term methodological pentagram to indicate a set of 5 main interrelated cornerstones of procedure. This was not any predefined scheme, but instead it emerged from the interplay between our research goals, our own research, and crucially, our dialogues with individual contributors during the research and writing process itself. The pentagraph's 5 main interrelated orientations are, of course, embedded within state-of-the-art insights into contemporary history, with due attention to wider elements of hierarchy, such as those related to gender, to social stratification, and most importantly, under those circumstances, factors intertwined with racism. Within these wider settings, the first cornerstone relates to biographical and prosopographic source materials. In Viktor Christian's case, this concerned old and new source materials on his personal biography before 1938, his letters and papers before 1945, as far as they are accessible today, but also cross-cutting quantitative assessments concerning his 5 collaborators in that LFVO unit, despite the intended disappearance of many sources around the end of the war. In fact, the Washington archives, whose materials had served to prepare the Nuremberg trials, turned out to be much more relevant in this regard than most public archives in Europe. The second cornerstone concerns an emphasis on actual practices as opposed to plans and to later justifications and apologetic explanations, to put it more precisely. Practices highlighting what in fact took place on the ground, including so-called fieldwork practices, of course. In the case of Viktor Christian's LFVO, later cover-up and silencing activities had to be critically overcome at every point. In one particular case, we felt as if moving through a thriller or a mystery novel while investigating whether Christian's young assistants indeed had been measuring and interviewing 35 African prisoners of war in a camp near Dresden, who were enslaved by enforced mining operations in contrast to all the Hague War Law Conventions. It is almost certain that these 35 African POWs perished in the course of events, and I'm still trying to identify their names and backgrounds through the private archives of relevant German mining companies. Not an easy task, by the way. The third cornerstone addresses networks, alliances, and dependencies, a very important methodological device in its own right, sometimes representing even the backbone of certain contributions to our 3 volumes, such as in Katja Geisenheiner's splendid analysis of how Vienna anthropology institutions interacted with others elsewhere in the Third Reich. Basically, this has to be qualitative network analysis because of the limited quantities of source materials, but also in view of what Ulf Hannertz once has addressed as thinking through networks. In the case of the LFVO, it became crucial to employ this type of network analysis to systematically explore not only how this unit's internal interactions took place, but also for a solid understanding how this unit interacted inside the Ahnenerbe with other units, of which there were 4 on today's Austrian territory. Among them, the most notorious one, in fact, in Salzburg, with its Inner Asian and Tibetan specializations, the Sven Hedin Institute, if you've heard of it. As a 4th cornerstone, we observed institutional history, including budgets and functions. Following the money, as Laura Nader and others have indicated, it is particularly important also in these cases, even if it implies a seemingly boring assessment of bank transfers and of internal administrative rulings. But this was indispensable for understanding that there were 2 subsequent phases in the LFVO's history, an earlier phase of little funding and a priority on internal confidential reporting and reviews, and a second phase of well-funded large-scale camp projects of the type I've just indicated, pursued in fact until the very last weeks and days before spring 1945. The 5th and last cornerstone concerns the genealogies of ideas, including the critique of hegemonic theories in historical contexts. If we think of earlier traditions in the writing of anthropology's history, from, say, Robert Lowy to, say, Marvin Harris, these genealogies of ideas were at one time the only thing that mattered, which certainly was one-sided at the time even, but that's no reason to entirely forget about it today. I have said in an earlier contribution that under the Nazi regime, those directions were combined with racist Nazi priorities that also played a certain role in post-1945 developments elsewhere in the West. This included strong priorities for some varieties of historical diffusionism, of functionalism, and of structuralism inside the ethnology of the Third Reich. In Vienna, a secularized version of diffusionism flourished under the Nazis after Führer Hammendorf, as the local representative of German functionalism, had left for India a week before the war broke out. The members of Victor Christian's Ahnenerbe were all followers of secular diffusionism, with a specific interest in Aryan origins in Iran or southern Russia, which was the core of the so-called Eastern thesis about Aryan origins that was legitimate inside the Third Reich. A careful examination of Christian's published works before 1945 shows that basically he was interested in playing down the role of Semitic speakers in Middle Eastern history and enhancing the role of Indo-Aryan speakers instead. The language-related parts of those camp investigations he directed, to an extent, also served these ideological purposes. We'll certainly be able to address related questions during our discussion after the following contributions by my 3 colleagues. So let me now introduce them to you. Peter Rohrbacher is a historical anthropologist with special expertise in sub-Saharan Africa, where he also carried out fieldwork in Namibia. More importantly even, he also is a historian of anthropology, especially for the field sources in German during the first part of the 20th century. He has been my truly wonderful and extremely productive co-editor for the 3 volumes presented today, and he continues to be a researcher at the Austrian Academy's Institute for Social Anthropology. Christian Feest is one of Europe's foremost authorities in the history of native North America. In fact, he's the only European co-editor for a volume of the Handbook of North American Indian book series. Christian is a professor emeritus at Frankfurt's Goethe University, an anthropologist of art and a historian in the field, and he's also a director emeritus of Vienna's Ethnology Museum, today's World Museum. Barbara Plankensteiner currently is director at Hamburg's Anthropological Museum, MARKK, a native of South Tyrol and hence an Italian citizen. She took a doctoral degree in anthropology at the University of Vienna before serving as curator at Vienna's World Museum and at the African Arts Collection at Yale. Barbara's work in sub-Saharan Africa has specialized on crafts and material culture, while she's also been continuously engaged in ongoing conversations and debates on decolonization and topics of restitution. Thanks for your attention, and I now hand over to Peter Rohrbach.
Thank you to everybody. Hello. Many thanks to the organizers, especially to Hanin. As a co-author and author of these 3 volumes, I would like to say a few words about our archive material. I put my slides now. Yes, here we go. Fundamental was the study of publicly available sources in Vienna and elsewhere in Europe, but also in North America, as it was mentioned, and in Asia. More than 100 different archives from 10 countries were consulted. Besides Germany, these include UK, Italy, Japan, Poland, Switzerland, Czech Republic, US, but also the Vatican. We carried out this extensive research work together with our 26 authors. Over the years, more and more cross connections to institutions and persons came apparent. And in this way, for instance, the networks that existed in Vienna and Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1938 were also worked out. These Nazi networks, which were banned in Austria before 1938, then played a very decisive role after the Anschluss. In 1938, in these networks, we did not limit ourselves to social anthropology, but also took into account neighboring disciplines such as physical anthropology, prehistory, African studies, folklore, and also Japanese studies. Interviews with contemporary witnesses and family members proved to be another important source. They supplemented the archival research in some cases that were still possible. For instance, Christoph Führer-Heimendorf, whom Andre Gingrich still knew personally, and whose son we were able to interview. Führer-Heimendorf was president of the RAI in the 1970s, and his closeness to the Nazi regime was little known so far. One innovative aspect is that we had access to so many private archives. Private collections convey the correspondences and networks much more authentically than official archives. In private, what was not allowed to be said before the state authority was reported or told much more openly. In this way, a number of nuances and shades, but also working constellations came to light that seem impossible in Nazi scholarship. And yet there were such niche positions. In the following, I would like to outline a few cases. Father Martin Gusinde was a member of the Catholic-style missionaries order. After 1938, he collaborated with the Nazi regime. This caused great commotion within the order. The letters show that in 1939, Gusinde intended to dedicate his still famous work, the Tierra del Fuego Indians, die Feuerland-Indianer, to Prime Minister Hermann Göring. At the same time, he submitted an application for habilitation at the University of Vienna, supported by the Cardinal. For the application, he had to make a declaration of loyalty of the Nazi state. He wrote, "I fully accept the existing National Socialist state and submit to it without restriction." Such statements are very irritating for a Catholic priest. Commissioned by the Academy of Sciences and the Natural History Museum, Kusinde conducted prisoner of war research. The background: after the Western campaign in 1940, many French prisoners arrived in Austria, among them many of African origin. Kusinde was considered an expert on Africa, and so he was called upon as a physical anthropologist in the camps. Annemarie Hefel, another case, wrote her dissertation on an African topic under the Nazi Institute director Hermann Baumann. As Gabriele Habinger points out, her letters show that the actual supervisor was not Baumann, but rather Father Wilhelm Schmid in exile in Switzerland. The young student affectionately called Schmid Uncle, as can be seen here, and she changed the contents of her doctoral thesis, which is indicated by the word frisieren. Baumann then dismissed Hefel from the Institute of Ethnology, calling her politically unacceptable, and another Schmid student stepped in to help her. Dominik Josef Wölfel from the Ethnology Museum. Through his network, he arranged a private employment contract for Hefel via the Nazi Reich Research Council in Berlin, and thus saved her from war service. This example is also explosive because Wölfel himself had previously been forcibly retired, called Ruhestand, from the Museum of Ethnology. He was married to a woman who was considered Jewish. However, Wölfel had influential mentors within the Nazi regime, such as Eugen Fischer, who continued to support him. Eventually, Wölfel even managed to involve in his wife's brother, Leopold Grünberg, who was also racially considered a Jew, in his Nazi-financed research. In our concept, we also took into account the networks in exile. There are several significant biographies on this. Verena Neller focuses on the great nephew of the German poet Heinrich Heine, Robert Heine von Heine-Geldern, who worked in Vienna. He had made a great name for himself as an archaeologist and historical ethnologist of Asia long before 1938. Shortly before the Anschluss, he fled into exile in the US and returned in the late 1940s to resume his professorship here. The term Southeast Asia, as we know it today, was popularized by him. Until then, colonial terms such as Dutch India, Hinter-Indian, or Indochina had been used. This met with a positive response, especially from the US authorities. His cultural studies contribution to the course of the war is also important. Through his work as an advisor to the US military authorities, he was able to ensure that the great cultural monuments of Southeast Asia were largely spared from bombardment. And finally, in US exile, Heine-Geldern was also a leading member of the Free Austrian movement. In the archives of the Steil Missionary Order in Rome, I found a small blue notebook with the inscription Œuvre Caritative Pontificale. It belonged to Father Wilhelm Schmid, the founder of the Vienna School of Ethnology. It proves that during his exile in Switzerland, the Austrian ethnologist was in close contact with military intelligence services, and with the help of the Vatican, he supported Wehrmacht deserters interned in Swiss camps. Finally, he subversively used Vatican money for intelligence operation, especially for British military intelligence SOE against the Nazi state. Schmid's influential social role as a donor and spiritual mentor of a resistance group called Patria, fighting for Austrians' independence, has so far gone unnoticed. The most important and prominent victim among the female graduates of social anthropology was Mariana Schmidl, presented by Katja Geisenheiner. Because of her Jewish origin, she was deported to one of the Polish camps in 1942 and died on the way there. Schmidl was killed. A few years ago, we dedicated a commemorative plaque to her in front of her home in Vienna. Andre Gingrich and I would like to express our sincere thanks to all the authors, including those we could not name here, for their good cooperation. Thank you, and now I hand over to Christian Feest.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, on here, yes, okay. First of all, let me say how pleased I am and how what a pleasure it was to be part of this project, of a book project that had shed much new light on the history of Austrian anthropology in dark years, which had not been considered seriously previously. So I'm very proud of being part of the team here. My contribution to this volume was with Hans Becker. The story of Hans Becker and his forays into anthropology is a rather strange and unusual one. Becker never held a professional position in anthropology, and after his death, no obituary was published in any scholarly journal. In the Austrian context, he is remembered, if at all, as a leader of the resistance against the Nazis. He spent a total of more than 3 years in concentration camps, but most of his writings on ethnological subject matter were published between his two internments. His political commitment against Hitler was unconnected to his earlier ethnographic work in Paraguay, yet these two strands of his biography became significantly intertwined at one point of his life, shedding some light on anthropology in Austria under National Socialism. Becker was born in 1895 into a family of minor nobility in the multicultural Austro-Hungarian Empire. Throughout his life, he considered himself to be first and foremost an artist. To please his mother, he entered law school in 1913. At the outbreak of World War I, he volunteered in the army and later served as a fighter pilot. After the war, he did not finish law school. Instead, he attended the Academy of Applied Arts, a course surveying at the Technical University, and made a living working for various financial institutions. In 1922, at the height of economic depression and hyperinflation, he emigrated to Argentina, where he worked as a project manager and surveyor for railroad companies, before moving to Paraguay in 1924 to oversee the construction of a rail line from Asunción into the Chaco. This brought him into contact with the Lengua and other indigenous groups, and like many others who contributed through their work to the endangerment of their traditional life, he felt compelled to produce a record of it, engaging in ethnographic fieldwork without the benefit of any academic training. His sojourn in South America came to an end in 1927, when he was visited by his friend Annalisa, a prima ballerina and daughter of a Jewish industrialist. On the way back to Vienna after the marriage in Buenos Aires, Becker had the opportunity of seeing Adolf Hitler in Munich, both in a public appearance and at a private party. He came to regard him, quote, this caricature of Charlie Chaplin, who in Austria could not have become more than a circus clown, as an especially dangerous gamey fool. In Vienna, he was shocked by the decline of political wars, but focused on his work as an engineer, manager of a shoe factory, artist, and journalist. A visit of a friend from Paraguay who sold his ethnographic collection to the Museum of Ethnology rekindled his interest in ethnology. In 1931, he became a student of anthropology under fathers Wilhelm Koppes and Wilhelm Schmidt, who were fascinated by a student who actually done fieldwork, whereas he had little use for their cultural historical method. His studies were sidelined in 1933 after the coup d'etat by Engelbert Dollfuss and the institution of one-party rule by the Austro-fascist Patriotic Front. At that point, Becker was working for a liberal weekly run by the daughter of a prominent former socialist. Within days of the forced closing of the newspaper, Becker, oddly enough, was hired by the Patriotic Front to head its fight against National Socialism in Austria. To Becker, this task was more important than his own serious misgivings about the new regime. However, the battle was doomed to fail because the front's ideological antibiotics against the Nazi virus were insufficient in substance and intensity. After the invasion of Austria by Hitler on March 13, 1938, cheered by a huge crowd of Viennese, Becker was detained along with more than 76,000 enemies of National Socialism. 3 weeks later, Becker was deported to the Dachau concentration camp, a life of hard labor and humiliation. In September 1939, when many other political prisoners had already been released, he was moved to the concentration camp in Mauthausen. Here he was finally assigned to the camp's construction office to plan and supervise the building of additional barracks, crematories, and a gas chamber. His wife Anna had in the meantime succeeded to emigrate to California. On the 1st of January 1941, Becker was unexpectedly released as a prisoner, but was made to work for 3 more months in construction office. From his hotel in Mauthausen, Becker re-established contacts with the outside world, especially with Etta Donner, whom he had met as a student in 1932, and with whom he had fallen in love when his marriage with Anna was in a state of crisis. Donner encouraged Becker to finish his studies on his return to Vienna. Becker's dissertation had been completed by 1936, but Koppers and Schmidt had gone into exile, and the department was now headed by the Nazi appointee Hermann Baumann, whom Donner had known when he had still been in Berlin. Returning from Mauthausen in April 1941, Becker had to attend first to his minors prehistory, art history, and philosophy, which he had neglected in the 1930s. His dissertation, written for Koppers 5 years earlier, was now submitted in June 1941 without significant changes, approved by Baumann within days on June the 30th. Baumann's report was endorsed 2 days later by the prehistorian Oswald Mengin, the Secretary of Education in the transitional Nazi government of 1938. Becker's application for admission to the orals was asserted the dissertation had been written at the suggestion and under the supervision of Baumann, thus obfuscating a now unseemly academic past. No mention was made in the accompanying CV of the fact, well known to everyone, that he had spent almost 3 years in Dachau and Mauthausen. In addition to Baumann and Mengin, his examiners in the orals included reports from Germany, art historians Hans Sedlmayr and the philosopher Arnold Gehlen, was recently imported by the Nazis. Exams were highly amicable, and on July 14th, the recent concentration camp inmate was awarded a PhD with distinction. Altogether, this remarkable speed and lenience of the procedure made it look more like a family rather than a state affair. Becker was promised to have his dissertation published in the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Vienna by none other than Victor Christian, already mentioned by André Gingrich, leading figure in the Nazification of anthropology in Vienna. A few days later, however, Christian had to retract his promise because the journal was published under the aegis of the SS organization Ahnenerbe. Now, a sponsorship of the SS by a book by the former anti-Nazi propaganda chief of the Patriotic Front would indeed have been preposterous. Already in March 1941, Becker's marriage to Anna Lisa had been annulled in an embarrassing action suggested by Donner. The lawyer argued that the plaintiff had, quote, only after his release from the concentration camp been enlightened about the harmfulness of a marriage with a non-Aryan woman. is about a man who probably had more Jewish than non-Jewish friends, and who certainly could have cared less about how later race laws would classify his wife. Hans and Etta were married in September 1941. Now, this is not the place and time to discuss Becker's role in organizing the resistance against Nazis in Austria since May 1941. Becker was working as a writer, architect, and painting pictures for Catholic churches until in February 1945, his cover was blown and he was arrested by the Gestapo once again sent to Mauthausen. Here he was saved from execution by the gradual disintegration of the system and ultimately by the liberation of the camp by the Americans. Becker's hopes to be rewarded in post-war Austria for his role in the resistance were disappointed. The resistance groups now had less clout than the politicians returning from exile, and perhaps more importantly, he was simply not from the same stable as the seasoned politicians. After being fobbed off with a subaltern government position, his friends finally succeeded in getting him a job in the Foreign Service, and in April 1948, he was appointed Chargé d'Affaires of the Austrian embassy in Santiago de Chile. However, only 8 months later, he was shot to death by a Polish emigrant whose wife was employed as Becker's housekeeper under circumstances that have never been completely elucidated. Etta returned to Vienna with her 2 daughters and later became director of the Museum of Ethnology in Vienna, a position for which in 1945 her husband had been rumored to be a candidate. But this is another story. Now, for those of you who are interested in further details and are not willing to wait for the English translation of the 3 volumes, there is indeed an expanded version of, sorry, sorry, I was clicking on the wrong button here. Well, this is Hans Becker here. But for those of you interested in an English version, is enlarged English version already published and also available on Academia and ResearchGate. Thank you for your attention. I'll pass this on to Barbara Plankensteiner now.
Welcome everybody, and it's a great pleasure to present my 2 articles in a very swift way today here. And I also enjoyed it very much to contribute to this volume because I digged very deep in the museum archive and found many things that I did not know before. So because I wrote 2 articles for that volume, one in which I tried to draw an image of the Museum für Völkerkunde in Vienna from 1938 to 1945, and another one on Etta Becker-Donner and the resistance at the museum. My overview concentrated on the museum, its staff, their interpersonal relations and attitudes toward the regime, and the exhibition program. Furthermore, I addressed the collection increase resulting from expropriations, expulsions, and war-related proceedings. Well, and I briefly start to kind of say something about the museum article, which had the title, The Museum of Ethnology in Vienna from 1938 to 45, a bastion stronghold of National Socialist Weltanschauung, ? I borrowed this quote from a scholarly publication about the Viennese ethnology that had been published in 1994 by the Austrian anthropologist Peter Linnemeyer, and in which he spoke about the museum director Röck in this, he qualified him in this way, and I quote, The term opportunism would hardly do justice to his collaboration in the machinations of the regime. Under his leadership, the museum did indeed become a bastion of nationalist socialist worldview, and I wanted to revisit his analysis. And his conclusion definitely applies to the museum's programming and work-specific focus. The director's attitude to his staff, whether loyal to the NSDAP or not, on the other hand, was benevolent and supportive. Did not engage in persecution or insinuations like some of his contemporaries did, but he submissively adopted the new rulers and profited from the prescribed worldview. He was a strong advocate for his museum during that time, of whose importance and significance he was adamantly convinced, and he used the spirit of the time to enhance that, his museum work. The research for this article, for me personally, brought to light some of the depths of human behavior. We all might have experienced competition and collegial meanness, intrigues in today's academia or museum world. However, during the National Socialist regime, such behavior received another dimension in a system in which denunciation and spying could have life-threatening consequences for those affected. The attitudes and behavior of the museum employees needs to be understood in the context of this oppressive climate. Then only a few stood out with civil courage. The climate became clear immediately after the Anschluss, when on March 17, in 1938, a few days after the invasion of Austria by the German troops, an existing Nazi cell deposed Hermann Michel, the first director of the Natural History Museum in Vienna, who was in that position since 1933. The reason given for his deposition was his collaboration with political Catholicism and a close relationship to Father Wilhelm Schmidt and his Culture Historical School of Ethnology in Vienna. At the same time, it was made clear to all employees that from now on new rules would prevail, whose observance would henceforth determine not only their professional, but also their personal fate and security. The threat was also directed at the colleagues of the Vienna Museum of Ethnology, which albeit opened in 1928 as an independent museum in the new Hofburg, remained administratively under the umbrella of the Natural History Museum. And then in November 1938, all public servants, including the staff of museums, are requested to prove their Aryan descent and that of their spouses. A year later, in 1939, the German Hans Kummerlöwe, former museum director from Dresden, a convinced National Socialist, was appointed first director of the Natural History Museum, including the Museum of Ethnology. He was the bearer of the Golden Badge of Honor of the NSDAP. Friedrich Röck, the director of the Museum of Ethnology, saw in the context of the new ideology an opportunity for the development of his discipline and was able to translate some of his own research ideas into exhibitions. Overall, Röck did not come into conflict with the regime at all with regard to the content of the museum, only in view of structural cutbacks. He further actively took the opportunity to expand the collection based on the expropriation of Jewish citizens. In retrospect, if one compares Röck's statements before the Anschluss with his attitude during the Nazi era, he could indeed be characterized as an opportunist who skillfully adapted to the prevailing conditions. Among the employees, there were both National Socialists and an underground resistance group regardless of their affiliations to the two fractions. All academics of the museum followed the prescribed line of the National Socialist regime and collaborated in colonial revisionist projects such as exhibitions or training courses for the colonial police and appraised confiscated collections of Jewish fellow citizens. This can be attributed to the strictly hierarchical system in which service instructions had to be followed. With the entry into the war, the museum was in a state of emergency. Not only the curatorial and research staff was severely decimated by the war efforts. For this reason, Röck was, who 15 years earlier had spoken out against the employment of female officials, now hired women for the curatorial service. He entrusted them mainly with organizational and coordinating assistant work. One of them, who started her museum career in that period, was Etta Becker-Donner, at the time still called only Donner. She was the first female anthropologist receiving an academic position at the museum. There were various assistants on temporary work contracts. Due to time, I cannot go into detail. Between them, an Indonesian-born Dutchman who was later killed in a concentration camp and first thought of being a NSDAP spy, or the Korean Hong Soo, who was working at the museum from 41 to 45 and later disappeared in North Korea and was mainly working on a large East Asia exhibition that should have been open in autumn 1944. In the years after the Anschluss, Röck organized a lively exhibition program for the museum, which was committed to the zeitgeist of the new rulers. So several projects on the symbolism and transcultural representation of swastika crosses, like in other ethnographic museums in Germany, but also a lively collaboration with the Asian art traders, Exner, with whom he organized several exhibitions with subjects based on Japan and Manchuria. So really following the NSDAP line, and both traders, father and son, were members of the NSDAP, just to mention. Considering the dramatic world political situation in mid-1944, it is impressive how Röck, while Europe lay in ruins around him in a state of war emergency, continued to plan exhibitions. If we compare it, for instance, with the museum in Berlin, that had already came to a virtual standstill by the early 1940s. So that is quite impressive. But all in all, Röck navigated in the system, on the one hand, by taking up subjects that corresponded to Nazi ideology, or by drawing on collections art from Nazi loyalists. In my second article on Etta Becker-Donner, I tried to situate her academic career between the ideological fronts and precariat of the war period. Christian Feser mentioned that she became Hans Becker's second wife in 1941, and she was also active in the resistance and part of resistant group in the museum. So when she started, she was a young research assistant at the lower age of the hierarchy. Before she was employed by the museum, she was a very renowned public figure as a young female researcher who had done fieldwork in Liberia in 1934 with the age of 22 and in 1936. And when she entered the museum, she withdrew from this public appearance because it happened after the Anschluss, and it related probably to the adverse position of her adverse position towards the regime. However, she was an ambitious young researcher and cultivated connections to the colonial revisionist circles in the Nazi academic scene and used them successfully for her academic career. Her mentor, for instance, was Dietrich Westermann in Germany, who probably played a decisive role in entrusting her with colonial revisionist agenda rather than Hermann Baumann at university. We can say that she seamlessly fit into the German Africanist circles of the time, which profited from the partial colonial interest of the Third Reich in Africa. But in her works, so not she does not reference any of the common racial research or National Socialist theories or relating terminology. At the museum, she was part of the resistance group led by Robert Bleichsteiner, the vice director, together with the director's secretary, a taxidermist, and the former curator Wölfel, who was mentioned already by Peter, who had been retired forcefully, as he already told us. This resistance group closely collaborated with the subversive resistance group at the Natural History Museum, led by Hermann Michel, who still was head of the mineralogy department and the deposed former director. The main contribution of this resistance movement were activities to secure the collections and to safeguard the museum building. The members were involved in salvage work of the collections, supported colleagues in distress, and passed on crucial information. Their important goal was to keep as many positions and functions as possible in the hands of critics of the regime in order to contain the influence of the National Socialists in the museum. The importance of the resistance in salvaging cultural assets, which were threatened with destructions by the Nazis at the end of the war in salt mines, was later on considered one of the successes of their resistance work. The difficulty to assess the resistance work at the museum lies in the fact that only reports from those involved are available, which are difficult to verify because absolute secrecy was necessary for survival. Written testimonies are therefore not available. According to the principle of the overarching resistance movement 05, of which Hans Becker was very instrumental, one person was only allowed to know a maximum of 3 others. The limitation of information had to work both upwards and downwards. So even if there are some consistencies in connection with the resistance activities that can no longer be clarified at present due to the scarce data available, Etta Becker-Donner's anti-national socialist commitment remains undisputed. Her husband in particular, but also she herself risked their lives for this and made enemies who continue to act against them even after the war.
Well, thank you very much indeed for these extraordinarily detailed and moving case studies. Please do feel free to put your question in the chat or to raise your hand. And just whilst colleagues are thinking about that, could I just ask the presenters a little bit about the putting together of the volumes and the way they have been received? Because clearly this is not only about the relationship of anthropologists to the occupying forces, but also about what happened afterwards, the rebuilding, whether people had to live alongside one another. And indeed, as this project was being conceived, was it very straightforward to do the research, or did you come across sensitivities and niceties that perhaps you would rather no longer existed, but you still had to acknowledge perhaps were there, or maybe there was nothing like that at all after so many years have passed? That would be absolutely fascinating to hear more about this.
Maybe I pick up that question and then Peter Rohrbacher might want to continue. I think there were good and bad surprises. On the one hand, it was indeed very difficult when it came to public sources to find out some of the more sensitive materials as one might anticipate, just as one knew that this concerned the SS or some higher party hierarchies. It often became increasingly difficult to find them out within the local Vienna archives or in Berlin or elsewhere, because as we know from some of the grandchildren of those involved, they had in fact been thinned out, as the term would be in German, after 1945, either by the persons involved or by their friends. So that was the unpleasant surprise in many cases, and that's why I mentioned that in many cases, at least those that I've researched personally, it turned out that the NARA, the National Archives in Washington, was sometimes, because these are archives that were under military protection at the time, was more resourceful in many individual cases, not in all, but in some cases. And in a few other cases, as Peter Robach has indicated, where you could find helpful and forthcoming family members in the second or third generation, the surprise was extremely great, even where the biographies had a few complicated twists, as in Führer Heimendorf's case, for instance. The children and grandchildren were quite open and cooperative and willing to help in elucidating. And the same goes also for the grandchildren of the notorious Victor Christian that we've been discussing. They are now politically active members of a liberal and the Green party in Vienna, and are, out of their own current worldview and political orientation, quite interested in helping where it is useful, and that is not only true for this particular family, but also in a few other cases. So in some cases, family contexts were very helpful, while in other cases where I would have thought it might work out well with family members, the result was nil. They wouldn't react and didn't want to get involved in these exploration into their family past. Maybe Peter Rohrbacher wants to pick this up from here.
Yes. Maybe it's worth to mention that I stepped into this project 2014, but I did research 4 years before in the Vatican archives, in the secret Vatican archives, and also in the Steil missionary archives. And this was a big question: will I get access or not? It's a private archive, this order archive in Rome, the Steil Missionary Society, and the Vatican archives have been closed for decades. But everything went successful, and I cannot complain. So all the papers, the letters, the correspondence in the Steil missionary archives are accessible, and I'm still wondering why I'm actually the only anthropologist who did research on this. I can mention years before I didn't, but now I do. There are 10,000 of letters of Pater Wilhelm Schmid and corpus untouched, especially the years after 45. And they are waiting for research. And the Vatican archives, the Vatican stuff, they're very friendly and open, and you could publish everything. They are very helpful. And now the second period is accessible of Pius XII since March 2020, which I didn't access yet, but I will do this as well. Another case maybe to mention, Dominik Josef Wölfel, the curator at the Museum of Ethnology. The whole correspondence is kept in his private flat still today. Everything is there. And a colleague of mine, Albert Rieger, he did his dissertation in 2000, and me, we were the only one who had access to this private collection of Wölfel. And there you find all the informations which were not published. And this was really gold to describe the hidden, the backstage of what was going on behind the scenes.
Thank you very much. And Barbara has her hand up, please.
Yes, for the museum, I have to say that, well, I was working in a museum at the time, so it was easy to have access to everything. But what was a little bit discomforting is that there must have been archival material about the period destroyed, because there was a lot of information missing, and particularly information on staff. So it was really difficult to reconstruct all the people who worked there, in which functions, and usually in the archives about staff, also things relating them are recorded, and all that material has been destroyed, probably from colleagues who worked earlier there, who removed compromising material, and I'm sure Christian Feest knows about that too. So that unfortunately was a negative surprise I made.
And I think Christian would like to say something, but you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, indeed, I wouldn't want to blame, wouldn't claim that there was bad will in the destruction of archival material. It may have happened. But in fact, I must say that in the 1980s, my colleague Alfred Janata and myself rescued whatever papers there were still left in the museum. They were about to thrown away by the cleaning woman. Yeah, and we put together what has now been the archive of the museum. Yeah, there was no interest in this before. So it was not bad will, but simply lack of interest. And let me briefly comment on the greater discussion here. I was really privileged in having full access to the family papers in the Becker family through his daughter and grandson, which was just marvelous. But still, I think what I've learned in doing my research on Becker is that we have to look in places that anthropologists usually do not look for information. So there's a lot of material out there that simply needs to be looked at, yeah, like in the Vatican archives, which is a logical place if you are dealing with Catholic missionaries in a way. But still, it's out of the well-trodden ways of anthropological historical research.
Yes, I would like to add, just as a footnote reminder, my current investigations in private enterprises, mining companies in Germany, as another unusual source where you simply have to dig and be persistent to find out what you're interested in. But there were a few cases that were intentionally displaced, if I may recall. Both the major democratic parties after 1945 were, after a certain point, competing to get the ex-Nazis into their realm of influence and become their new voters. And so from both sides, there were helpful hands in letting this or that awkward personal staff file disappear, or more often even not disappear, but be displaced into a cabinet where it shouldn't belong to, so that it would never be found again.
Indeed, indeed. Well, what we'll do is we'll just take a question from Maxim Brahmi here, which is related. Also, he wants information about a particular person. And he says, thank you so much for these fascinating talks. Can you tell us more about the prehistorian Oswald Mengin and his role in the Seyss-Inquart government and why he resigned, if indeed he did? So I don't know which of colleagues would.
A long story.
Yeah.
Well, we have time.
A long story, but maybe I start. Mengin, he was from South Tyrol, and he was the leading prehistorian in Vienna. And in 1910, so actually before the founding of the Republic, Austrian Republic, he adopted the culture circle theory of Walter Wilhelm Schmidt. He states this in his major work, Weltgeschichte der Steinzeit, World History of the Stone Age, which was published in 1931. And during these decades, 20 years, there was a close cooperation between Schmidt, Koppers, and Mengin, because the idea was the culture circles should be adopted to prehistory and show and demonstrate that the culture history circle theory is right. Now, unfortunately, or let's say it happened that that Mengin represented the right wing of Catholic thinking, intended more and more to National Socialist ideas. And it was an open question whether this happened, the break between the fathers and the prehistorian. And during my starting with my new project, I could find out that the break happened many years before 1938. It happened actually after the resensation of Koppers. He didn't wrote well about this volume of Mengin, and he really said, how could you fall in my back, Koppers, my friend. And after this, 1932, there was a break, and Mengin went more and more to the National Socialist and became finally, with Seyss-Inquart, the Ministry of Education. He held this position in a very short period, only 2 months, from March to end of May 1938. So some could argue, okay, that's nothing, but exactly in this short period, in these 2 months, all the changes happened after the elections.
Yeah.
Yes. So he had a crucial role in the Nazi period. And
the Seyss-Inquart government is what Norwegians would call their Quisling. It's sort of the collaborators government of Austrians while handing over power to the Nazis. So he was in that government. And after 1945, he took the Red Line, as it is called by British historians, from the Vatican to, befittingly, Argentina, where he then built up a second career under the pseudonym Osvaldo Mengin, and wrote another Spanish world history of I think, South America, Stone Age. So he also was readmitted as a member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences shortly before he died.
Indeed, food for thought. Thank you very much. Now, I can see that there's a hand up here. So Jan Hasselberg, would you like to ask your question live? if you would like to unmute yourself and go ahead, please. Oh, at the moment we don't have sound. I don't know why. You don't look like you're on mute, but maybe there's a connection issue. We can see you.
There might be a connection issue
Okay,
because
so
we can't quite see if that he's muted.
yeah, if it's a connect, would you like to put your question into chat, please? I'm so sorry. We would be delighted.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
we can. Oh, there we go. Go ahead, please.
All right. All right. Yeah, I have done some work with the photographs from Papua New Guinea by Viennese ethnographer Hugo Bernatzik. And he published his Große Völkerkunde in 1939. So what I wondered, did he still have some influence with his writing or as a person in Vienna at the time?
Well, I think the short answer really is that he remained fairly successful and widely popular as an author and as a photographer, but he was always looked down and pushed around by the academic establishment. Before the Nazi years and right through the Nazi years, and after the Nazi years, everybody was finger pointing at him and said this was the only Nazi among the anthropologists, which is not true. Certainly is not true. He was, an opportunist who tried to continue being successful even while the Nazis came to power in Germany. But it was in some of his major publication projects in the later years that he also explicitly used Nazi terminology. Most of his other books that had been successful in Austria already before 1938 went through second and third and fourth editions. In fact, they belonged to the most widely read anthropology books published under Hitler. So his influence among the, let us say, laypersons interested in anthropology was much larger than among the academic circles.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Now, I know that Peter wanted to return to Adam Cooper's question. So if I read out Adam's question again, for which thank you very much, then Peter, you can return to it if you like. And Adam says, what about the influence of the Catholic missionary project on Austrian anthropology before World War II?
Yes, the short answer is there was a great influence, and I demonstrate this with the argument that Schmid, before he initiated the Institute of Ethnology in Vienna in 1929, he was already the director of the Missionary Ethnological Museum in the Vatican. And it's his own story how how he got this position. But it's worth to study the audience talks with with Pope Pius XI, Achille Ratti. He was a linguist, and Schmid could convince him to study the hunter and gatherer societies as he outlined before, and he financed the so-called expeditions to these areas. And Schmid didn't do the field work. He organized the field works with the Vatican's money. We can name the names Schibester, Pater Paul Schibester. We can name Gusinde. We can name others of the missionary society, of the Steil Missionary Society, but also other missionaries from other orders. The Philippines, Malaysia, South Africa, all these expeditions had been done, had been organized by the Pope's money. And so the influence was very strong. But in fact, the empirical data which were collected by these field workers did not strengthen the theory of Pater Wilhelm Schmid. That's the result. So the monotheism and the first family order was the monogamy, or this they couldn't prove.
Maybe if I am allowed to add, I think that despite all ideological and theoretical and conceptual criticism that is appropriate for the Vienna School and for Schmid in particular, one should nevertheless emphasize that with all due source criticism applied to their writing, their contributions to hunting and gathering societies remain an indispensable and invaluable part of our global ethnographic records. We would not know what we know today about the recent decades of hunting and gathering societies were it not for the fieldwork of Koppers and Schwester, and to a minor extent also Guzinde, in parts of South America, in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in parts of Southeast Asia.
That brings me onto something which I never really understood, which is the relationship between Koppers and Schmid. I mean, Koppers appears to me a more liberal man, more willing to work with the academic establishment as distinct from the Catholic Church. Would you place him, as it were, as a proto-modern, or is he still firmly in the pre-modern? Any thoughts you have, I would be most interested to hear.
Christian, would you like to address that? It's a difficult question, actually.
It's a difficult question. Man, it is.
I almost met Koppers. I never met him in person. He died a year before I became a student, so no personal experience with him.
I mean, I started the correspondence of Koppers very deeply, and it is true that he felt as a shadow of Schmid. So he was always in the background, and on the one hand, it is true he was quite much more modern. For instance, he tried to leave Switzerland in his exile to go to the US following Heine Geldern, but it didn't work because of the order was very strict and didn't allow this step of Koppers. On the other hand, his field work in India on the Beel actually was, in his view, an empirical proof of monotheism. So actually, his field work in India tried to prove Schmid's theory. So
yes, but it also tried to prove that the non-Aryans had contributed, like the Beel, had contributed decisively to the history of Indian civilization. So he was pursuing quasi a non-Aryan centered cultural history of India, which which was
in those days very progressive.
Quite progressive in those days, yes.
Yes, certainly. If you look at our institute archives, the letters by Koppers are universally extraordinarily polite and friendly and cordial, and the ones with Schmidt tend to be a little bit more touchy. Yeah.
Yes, and Schmidt also had extremely bad manners, I think one can safely say in retrospect. He was pushing around many of his own loyal students as if they were his servants. He had a scandalous affair with his housekeeping lady at his age of 81 or something. And there are many things that you would never find in Koppers' records. So I think one could safely add 60 or 70 years later that Koppers was a much more decent man.
And you don't find anti-Judaism at Koppers' correspondence or publications. Huh?
Yeah.
I'm conscious that we haven't got that much time left, and I was going to ask for an overview. For people who are perhaps new to this material, I don't know whether you feel able to offer a summary of, did anthropologists collaborate or not? And it's a very simple question, and perhaps obviously this is much more nuanced than that. But for example, I've read books on the French museums in the Second World War, and how some of them came and set up a resistance cell immediately and so on. But whilst you're thinking about that general question, there's a question from Chris Hahn, which talks about Richard Turnbout, and is wondering whether your project has turned anything new up on his subject, whose contacts by this time in the 1930s were mainly in Berlin. And I just have to let my son in. He's just back from school, as you heard the knock, but I'll leave you with this question from Chris Hahn for the moment, and back in a moment.
Peter Rohrbach and I have been pursuing Turnwald's career along two different timelines since this book came out, because yes, during the Nazi years, he was no active anthropologist in Vienna, but in Berlin and elsewhere in the Third Reich. So this is really Peter's field of expertise, but it is not covered in our 3 volumes here. But maybe he would like to say a few words.
Yeah, it touches me because at the moment I'm writing on this issue on Turnwald's role during the Nazi era. And I'm wondering, because all the files which are kept in the archives in Berlin are merely untouched. And I ordered 2,500 letters, which arrived a couple of weeks ago, and I'm studying them now. And what I can say is it's tricky, yeah, because he collaborated, of course, and he was a colonial expert, and he acted as an advisor, and he contributed also to colonial handbooks, articles, but all these handbooks, which were financed by the colonial administration of the Nazi administration in Berlin, were not published. So after the war, one could say there was nothing, no? But the archives say something different, and this will come out this year.
Well, no, thank you very much. I hope that's helpful. Well, as I say, we're in the final stage now of our fascinating afternoon. And I think, yes, some general pointers. So if a colleague is giving a lecture and the students ask, what did happen during the war? Could you give us some pointers as to how we're to preliminarily answer that question?
Yes, I think on the one hand, at least in this part of academia, contrary to what has been said about the huge element of collaboration by Austrians with the Nazis, the element of resistance, explicit or tacit, is a bit stronger than one might have thought until recently among the anthropologists. That's one element. The second element is once they manage to find their way into enforced exile, many of the anthropologists there either were good cooperators with the Allied forces, as Führer Hermendorf was in the end in India, or they were actively engaged in resistance activities, as Hennegelder was on the US side. There were a few minor figures, by the way, who found their way into Scandinavian, that is actually Swedish and exile, apart from the Swiss locus of the missionaries. So the exile role and the resistance role should not be silenced, because I think it is important and it is also something to be appreciated. I mean, after all, it was an anthropologist, as Christian has mentioned and elaborately demonstrated, who was the founder of the one influential resistance organization that was active in Austria, 0505. And then in a few sentences, yes, who was allowed to continue working as an anthropologist, was involved in drastic forms of cooperation, which ranged from serving the army in embedded frontline field operations in North Africa, beyond propaganda, of course, for the museums, in an era when the museums counted much more than today because of the changing media landscape, up to doing imprisonment, field work among camp inmates. So the spectrum of collaboration was wide. Many, especially junior anthropologists, shortly before or after the doctoral degrees, were participating in these gruesome and partly bloody applied forms of anthropology that actually took also place during the Nazi era. And some were victims, and we've mentioned a few today.
Well, that's a very powerful summary. Thank you very much indeed. Well, we're almost at half past. I think that we simply have to thank our speakers for an afternoon that will remain long in the memory, and congratulate you upon a project which is a model of anthropological research, of archival research, that we can simply show to people and say, if you really want to use archives to demonstrate how history should be written, here is what you must look at. So thank you certainly from all of us for so kindly sharing it with you. I think what I should do now is simply pass over to Hanin, who will close the session down for today. And so, well, once more, thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thank you to all our speakers. This was really very interesting. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for everybody who came, who stayed for both parts or only one. I'm going to change to gallery view for everybody now for a last moment if you want to wave goodbye. So we wish you all a really pleasant afternoon and evening. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here.